This week on The Grit Crusade,
of where suffering and celebration are forced to coexist, and we sometimes fight them, right? We fight that first Christmas after losing a loved one, or we fight those things because we don't want to step into celebration when we feel like we've been assigned to suffering.
Hey, Grit Crusaders, welcome to the podcast and the final episode in our mini-series with my favorite female co-host. I gotta say that because I had David Roberts was my co-host before this, and I loved him too, right? And my best friend, Dani Hardy. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
This has been a fun series.
It has.
I kind of feel like it's been like a peek into our friendship. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like the kind of conversations that we have, like sitting down with two friends. So, yeah. So we're wrapping up this series called Navigating. And we've talked about, let me look at my notes so I don't forget. Navigating Hard Seasons was episode 1. We'll link that in the show notes. We did Navigating Motherhood. And our last episode was Navigating Grief, which I feel like we did an awesome job on, in the fact that we didn't spend the whole episode talking about death.
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know, because you hear that word grief and it's like the association's death, but we talked so much more than just that. So,
Yes.
So today we're talking about navigating tension. Tension, yeah.
Well, and one thing I love about how this has evolved organically is that we have had these smaller conversations, but with the same topic of navigating, there have been common threads through each of the episodes.
Yeah, there is.
So if you're picking up here, stop and go back to the first one and go from beginning to end, because there have been threads throughout that I think link the conversations together really beautifully.
And we didn't talk about this in the first episode of this series that we should have, but so we talk on Marco Polo. So if you haven't used the Marco Polo app, you can like video chat your friends, but then it doesn't take space up on your phone, and then you just listen to it when you have time. It's not like intruding into their day. But all of our topics came up through our Marco Polo threads, and then I like added them to our notes so I could keep up with them over time. So they also came up very organically, because we're like, well, this is like a navigating, talking about just life and all the things here. So so today we're going to talk about tension, and this one kind of came from, so Dani is a women's pastor here in Central Arkansas, and she spoke at a women's conference that I attended in early 2023, and I loved when you have friends that are smarter than you and wiser than you, then you know you're choosing the right people. I always say I don't want to be the smartest person in the room, or I need a new room to be in, you know? But she talked about this topic of, and I don't know if tension or whatever, however is the best way to describe it, but that you can be this, I got my hand in the air for people listening online, and this at the same time.
Right.
So you can be bold and afraid at the same time.
Sure.
Like you can be a mom and be unsure about motherhood at the same time.
Right.
You know, you can, we don't necessarily have to completely shut off one side of our life for the next side of our life, you know? Right. And so I'll let you talk about it for a little bit. Yeah.
So how I like to frame that, well, multiple things. So we would like to believe sometimes that we are simpler than we actually are. And so we try to reduce ourselves to single scenarios where we're only happy or we are only sad, because that feels easier to cope with or deal with in the circumstances of our life. And so we try to simplify. But when we can accept the fact that we are actually incredibly complex creatures, then we give ourselves the freedom to live more experientially as our life is coming to us, that we then have the liberty to experience what I like to call both and, which is not unique to me. That's been said before. But living this out as a principle in our lives is very freeing. It has been for me. I think I've seen other people find liberty through this idea.
Oh, yeah, me for sure. Yeah. And all the women that attended with me that day, because I took several girlfriends and my mother-in-law with me, and that both and concept was huge.
Yeah. Is that we can experience seemingly opposite circumstances simultaneously, and we can exist equally in both.
Well, we talked about in the third episode of this series of grief and celebration.
Yeah.
You can, or grief and
suffering and celebration.
Suffering and celebration. That's what it was.
Yeah.
So you can be suffering and also celebrate in that time as well.
Yeah.
Which seem to be two very different situations.
Right.
That you maybe wouldn't associate with each other.
Right, because we have this idea that if I feel celebratory in a season of suffering, that I'm somehow diminishing my suffering.
Yeah.
And you said about in that last episode about whenever you laughed for the first time after losing your mom, that you almost felt guilty, you know?
Yeah.
And I had a conversation this week with a girlfriend who lost her mom. And this friend of mine was celebrating her birthday this week. And I was encouraging her and saying, like, you have permission right now, today, as you're eating this dessert, to celebrate your birthday, even though you're in the midst of suffering still the loss of your mom. And so that's just an easy example that I think we can all pull from our own life story of where suffering and celebration are forced to coexist. And we sometimes fight them, right? We fight that first Christmas after losing a loved one, or we fight those things because we don't want to step into celebration when we feel like we've been assigned to suffering. And that's just a single example, but there's so many nuances to this because we are not simple creatures. We are complex creatures. There are layers to how we feel, how we show up, and who we are. And so our ability to accept the both and of our lives that, for me, and for you too, right? Like we are both assigned to motherhood and we're both assigned to career. And so we can be both. It is not easy, right, to do both and in these scenarios, and we have limits, which we've talked about, but that inside of those assignments that we can show up to both to the best of our ability, but that requires a lot of courage and acknowledgement of self-awareness, which I think you talked about a lot in one of our other episodes, is that we do these overlaps of career and motherhood, or a season where we know we're being assigned to rest, but we still have work to do. We still have a home to take care of, perhaps a job to be in, or just the daily task of living our lives. But that learning this rhythm and this cadence of work and rest, that it can be both. And that's in actual activities, but then this also can be internalized to just how we feel, how we're showing up emotionally, that we can be both cautious and excited. And those could feel like opposing emotions.
And they are hard to feel.
And they're hard to feel.
I'm living that right now. Like living the caution of, ooh. I did an episode on this too, on a book called Chasing Failure.
Yeah.
So we'll add that to the show notes. Of when you say the word potential, like they reached your potential. What is your potential?
Oh, yeah.
Because like, how high is that really?
Sure.
Yeah, well, I'm chasing it. And I'm pushing it to see right now. I'm there. And so that cautious feeling is also very exciting at the same time. And those things are hard to reconcile sometimes.
Yeah.
They really are.
But that's if we're living with an either or mindset, that we can only either be cautious or excited, because we think excited is like throwing it all caution to the wind, right? And just running headlong into the wind. And that's not the case, because we're complex people.
Well, I think I have been struggling in the past with, so I'm a sleeper. I sleep really well.
Yeah.
But being anxious or sleeping, I can be anxious and tired.
Yeah.
Like I can rest and still be anxious also.
Sure.
And accepting that that's okay. And then I can put that to bed for the night.
Yeah. And the reason we're calling this tension is because navigating tension is because acknowledging that these unique complexities exist within us can cause tension of how we perceive ourselves a lot of times.
Man, right?
And how we perceive our circumstances or how we perceive other people. But I shared in the very first episode that I have this opinion that nothing is ever only one thing, right? Because there's always more at play, because life isn't just something simple. It is complex.
And it's never a snapshot.
No. And
ever.
there are so many layers to how we're evolving as people, and how, for me as a Christian, how I'm becoming more like Christ, right? So there's this evolution of who I'm becoming. But so I'm never only one thing. And we see, I'll use Jesus as an example because that's my go-to, is that he exemplified the full range of human emotion. We see him angered in the temple, flipping over tables. We also see him weeping beside the people who were weeping. Like we see both, and those are both part of the human experience, and one doesn't diminish the other. We also saw him full of joy. We saw him laughing. We saw him with children. We saw him engaging, doing all kinds of things that reflect the humanity that existed in him as Christ. And those things exist in us as humans. And sometimes we shy away from one experience or the other because we think that they diminish our reputation, they diminish our human experience, they diminish
our image
or our other emotions, right? And so we think, well, if I'm ever angry, No, you can have anger. You can
Then
feel.
I have a temper. No,
Right?
maybe you just are angry right now.
And so we attach those things to us in a way that allows guilt to build, and that allows tension in. And so learning how to navigate through that tension to say, no, like I am a complex person and I can feel both angry and thankful.
Yeah, that's good.
Right?
That's
or I can
good.
feel both. I'm going to pull out my feelings wheel because, I love that.
You have a feelings wheel?
I do right here from my friend Jen.
Oh my gosh.
I know I've
Okay, so
mentioned
you're
her.
going to have to give me a picture of that and we'll link it in the, show notes. Yeah, we'll put it in the show notes. So a feelings
right. So
wheel.
I can feel in a moment, we talked about suffering. I can feel both lost in a moment if I'm sad and feeling like I'm without purpose. I can feel lost and joyful. And those could be like seemingly opposite emotions, but they don't have to be. They can exist inside of us in the same moment. I think about like time periods where I can become really overwhelmed with tasks because I'm a task-oriented person and I have to focus on being people-oriented. But my husband is the exact opposite. He is people-oriented all day and he has to focus really hard on being task-present. And so in a moment, I can be both present with my children in the yard, playing and laughing and having fun, and thinking about what needs to happen next, planning dinner, looking at the clock and saying what time is bath time, do we have homework tonight? I can exist equally in both places because I'm not simple. I'm complex. And I used to shy away from that because someone in my life previously from a toxic relationship told me that I was too much. You're just too much. And my response became, for you.
Yeah, I don't know that I would like you if you weren't too much. Like, I love that about you, right?
And I love that about me, too.
I love that you're too much.
And I'm okay with that, but I haven't always been okay with that because I didn't know that I had permission to exist inside the tension of both and, that I could be multiple things at one time. And I'm a great multitasker, and so I used to think this was just about task, and it's not. It's about how I'm existing as a human. And earlier you were giving the example as we were trying to think of some juxtaposed, like, emotions or statuses in life. And I thought about my friend who she just sent off her oldest to college, and she had a lot of grief sending him to school. That's her baby. He's at the U of A, so he's just a few hours away, but he's not at home. He's somewhere off. And that was a huge point of grief for her. And I watched her, and we kind of came up with this language around that she is both releasing her oldest son, and so releasing even part of her motherhood.
Yes, you're like of who you see yourself as.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And she's receiving what's next in this stage of life. So she is releasing and receiving simultaneously. And I think the posture to do that well requires a lot of courage, because we know in life there are certain things we're signing up for. Right? And they take courage to navigate. But even the things beyond that we're not signing up for, that we didn't know were going to come, that we didn't know we're going to feel as hard, that takes like next level courage for us to be willing to accept the things as they are and decide how we're going to move through them. And so even something like releasing and receiving, which I think you could use against all sorts of transitions. I mean, I think about y'all in the business in this new building for Empire.
Yes.
And that you're both releasing what was with full gratitude and expectation of what it has been, but then receiving with expectation. And that requires a ton of courage.
Tons of courage. And it can exist at the same time as being afraid.
Yes.
Like, what if it doesn't work out?
Right.
What if we jump too big?
Right.
What if the leap wasn't big enough? And
Right.
what God tells me every time is he says, I called you to it.
Yeah.
I called you to it.
Yeah.
And I didn't really want to open a new building.
Yeah.
I really wanted to stay comfortable with the bills I had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think about, you're talking about courage, and I was looking up the definition. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the presence of action in the presence of fear.
Yeah, in the face of fear. It really is. Because if something wasn't scary or you weren't afraid, right, fear, then courage wouldn't exist.
Yeah.
Like, courage exists.
Courage wouldn't be needed.
Right. Yeah. It exists to triumph over the uncertainty, the fear, And it's a both and situation for sure.
Courage is the conduit, right? That we move from fear into action.
Yeah.
It's the way that we maneuver into action
like electricity.
in spite of our fear.
Like electricity moving through a conduit.
Yes.
Like in a house, you turn the switch on and then pulses the electricity.
Courage carries our action through a posture of fear. And so I think sometimes we look at things that scare us and we shy away from them, or we look at things that we feel uncertain about and we shy away from it, when we're really being called and invited into a posture of courage, that those things can exist simultaneously.
Yeah, they can. They really can. The work and rest, though, that you mentioned on earlier.
Yeah.
So I think for me, I used to define rest as like a nap or like sleep.
Yeah, that's sleeping.
That's sleeping, right?
Yeah.
But being able, you were talking about having the mindset of being present and having fun with your kids and thinking about the other things that you have to do. But realizing that you can find rest in things that you enjoy, and it doesn't just mean sitting down and sitting still.
Right.
For those people who are very busy at work and have big careers or big callings, whether it's ministry or corporate or small business or, independent sales, you can do that, and you can find rest in things that you enjoy without feeling guilty.
Right.
Because I still struggle. I still have that like little devil on my shoulder when I sit down to watch TV every time.
Yeah.
Every time.
That you should be doing something.
I should be doing something. But what I'm doing is I'm sitting in the same room with my husband, and he really likes that at night.
Yeah.
And so, and we're not huge like Netflix people, but we're usually watching like a show. Maybe we'll watch a show or a documentary or something, and just to have like, and it gives us common conversation, common language to talk about something. We just finished watching The Painkillers. It's called Painkillers.
Right, I've seen that
documentary on Netflix about the opioid crisis, which is near and dear to my heart.
Right.
And so just giving, but not having that guilty feeling of, but I could be getting that laundry put away and folded.
Yeah.
Because that's what I do every day. And every day I got to get that laundry put away and folded. Otherwise I'm going to get behind. And learning to live in that moment of, I can do that laundry in a little bit and sit here with my husband and have a conversation about something that we're watching or talking about or whatever,
Well, the undergirding of that mentality, that we need to be doing something, that work and rest cannot exist simultaneously. The undergirding of that is that our value resides in what we do more so than in who we are.
Right.
And our value isn't attached to our doing. Our value exists in and of itself in our innate being.
That is the hardest thing that I have learned over the last decade.
Yeah.
I became self-employed. So I'm literally putting food on my table and other people's tables.
Yeah.
So it became all about the work. That's all it was.
Right.
And so that was who I was.
Right.
And I had to discover my identity outside of what I did.
Yes.
And that's really hard.
Right. And it's being able to trust, like for me, being able to trust that God is at work when I'm at rest. And God is at work when I am at work, because he's always at work. And so I'm safe to rest because I'm not somehow I don't have to hustle all the time to make things happen. Because
That's good.
You know what I mean?
That's
And
good.
like, I'm a hustle girl. Like, I can hustle and get a whole lot of things done, but I'm no more valuable in my hustling than I am in my resting.
That's good.
And so it's the ability.
So hustle and rest. Like we're talking about work and rest, but like hustle and rest.
Because those feel opposite,
Yeah,
right?
that's
There's this cadence or this rhythm to the idea of being a boss girl, or like, I got to have my hustle. Like, we can, yes, go for it. But then also to add to it is that when you're in a season of hustle and I'm in a season of rest, and not just for a day, but like a season where I'm assigned to rest more than I produce, and you're in a season of production, right? I could look at you and I could negatively compare us, and I could feel bad about me and have the inability to celebrate you. And so if we're going to do this whole juxtaposing ideas and this both and lifestyle, we have to do it outside the context of negative comparison.
Absolutely.
That I have to be able to say of your life, girl, you are hustling, you are making things happen, you are producing so much, I am so for you, run on. While you do that, I'm going to rest.
And be okay with it. We talked about too, like being able to celebrate someone else in your season of suffering.
Yes.
You know, like just because somebody else is having a baby and you've had a recent loss.
Right.
You can celebrate them and still be in your suffering.
And I had to learn how to do that.
Yeah. And I think you taught me a lot of that as well. Yeah.
And I had to learn how to do that in a way that felt comfortable and right for me. And so one thing that I'll do just to share a personal, like, you know, side story to this is while we were in the midst of miscarriage after miscarriage, and I was longing for a second child, every family in our church that would have a baby or friend that would have a baby, I couldn't necessarily face a baby shower because I had to see people. And I didn't know that I could like really show up the way I would want to show up. But what I could do was cook a meal when that baby was born and have Dusty go and deliver it. And I would pray for them while I made them a meal. And I would pray for that baby and I would thank God for that baby. All the while I was longing for my own second child. And I couldn't show up because if I value authenticity, it is in my top 5 core life values is authenticity. And I couldn't show up at a shower and be fake because my level of celebration wasn't where I wanted it to be. But I could sit at my stove and I could cook a meal for that family and I could pray for them and I could love them well. And so I could celebrate in the way that felt right for me.
Yeah, because I think you do have to be authentic about it, you know?
Yeah. You
can't show up. I mean, you talk about courage and fear. You know, you actually have to feel and embrace that courage.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to remind yourself or be reminded of the fact that you can be courageous. Yes. And you need those right voices in your village for that too.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
That's a hard one because the world tells you that you can't. You know? So succumbing to the fear is the easier thing to do.
Yeah.
It's easier to take that route out and not, like you said, courage is like the conduit to our action, right? So it's going to carry our action, but it's easier to not act and to just be in that fear.
It is. And I would say, like you were talking about our ability to celebrate for someone else when they're experiencing the victory that we're longing for. And that courage, that creates tension, right? When we have an expectation or a hope for our circumstances and they are different in actuality.
And especially when they're given to someone else.
And they're given to someone else. But if we live with an either or mentality, that's a scarcity mentality. Either she wins or I lose.
Right.
You know, or if she wins, then I lose.
It's like
if I win, then she loses.
Right.
But it could be both and.
There's enough wins for everybody.
Right? That there's not a scarcity. There is an abundance of gifts, and there's an abundance of things we can feel in and of ourselves. It doesn't have to be either or. I'm not so scarce of a person that I can't hold the tension of excitement and fear, or excitement and caution, or awareness and contentedness. I can hold all of those things because I'm an abundant person, because I'm a complex person. And we try to oversimplify it. When we oversimplify, we lead ourselves right to a scarcity mentality where we only want to look at life, our circumstances, and other people as either or, and it just doesn't have to be that way.
I love that. The both and. That verbiage, just having that verbiage in your mind makes so many situations like you look at them from a different lens, you know, and realizing that it doesn't have to be someone else's gain, doesn't have to be your loss. Your loss doesn't have to be your loss forever. Like you can be sad right now and hopeful for the future.
That's right.
That it won't always be this way.
That's right.
You know, and that's good. And so the other thing that we were wanting to talk about too, that you touched on a minute ago though, and I want to talk a little bit more about releasing and receiving at the same time. But first, you have our trivia.
Ooh, I do have trivia.
Yeah, so for you guys that it may be your first episode, it's a fun segment we like to do on the podcast that typically is completely unrelated, but sometimes it's related. It's called Trivia in the Trenches. The Trivia in the Trenches.
Get it out, girl.
Where I ask a question to my guest, or in this case, my co-host is bringing the trivia to me. So, all right, Dani, you ready?
Okay, I'm ready. Right. So, Trivia in the Trenches. Okay, so we've been friends for a very long time, and we've had some tension in our friendship and tension in just in life that we've learned to navigate together. So I went the friendship route with this.
Okay.
So in a lifetime, how many friends do you think the average person makes?
Oh, see, I could get all analytical on that and be like, what defines a friend? And but I'm not going to do that.
Just go, go
surface level.
Yeah.
Okay, the average person in a lifetime, a friend they have, like 7?
No.
Oh, like way more. Okay.
Yeah.
Like 25.
In a lifetime, you make 396 friends.
Clearly not both and here. Clearly I'm saying 7. Y'all can see how many friends I've got.
But then the other side of this is how many of those friendships last?
Oh, 7. I don't know how many.
1 out of 12.
Yeah.
1 out of 12 out of 396. So how many sets of 12 are in 396? And then
2 or 3, 7.
7.
I don't know. Is it
comes
right?
out to 7. I don't know. But isn't that great?
That is.
And that's crazy to think about that. But that in and of itself could cause tension for people because they're like, I hadn't had 396 friends.
Yeah, but do you think if you're defining friends as like people that you meet, acquaintances, used to work together, now you don't work together like that, I could see it adding up like that, you know? I think your definition of friendship would have to be, you know, kind of defined. But great trivia.
Well, it's because I was going with the whole, like,
friendship
how many
theme.
of them last for a lifetime,
You didn't want to do, like, my trivia in the trenches from the 3rd episode when I asked about teeth whitening and the answer was urine?
No.
Yeah.
Or Vaseline.
Vaseline.
I was going,
Wonder Jelly.
imagine this. I was going for, like, a more profound connection or, like, a deeper. Yeah.
See, you're the feelings girl.
I am.
I love it.
even have a feelings
wheel in her journal. Like, who has a feelings wheel? That
Dani.
is crazy.
I own it, girl.
I know
It's
you
good.
do. I know you do. I love it. That's where your wisdom comes in good. Okay, before we wrap up this episode, though, let's go back and touch on. So we kind of like high level touched on work and rest, which we've now have apparently renamed to hustle and rest.
There you go.
So I like that one too.
Yeah.
We've talked about courage and fear.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about your friend who is sending their child off to college,
Yeah.
releasing and receiving. And so where this really shows up for me in my life and my journey and the women and men that I work with is, you know, being in my late 30s, I'm fixing to be 40, I see this mentality or mindset of people kind of looking at who they're becoming in the next season of life. Mm-hmm. You know, typically when you're in your 40s and 50s is when maybe your children go off to school. Maybe you decide on a new career. Maybe you were a stay-at-home parent and now you're deciding to build a career. Mm-hmm. Maybe you're buying a home for the first time. So there's all these like big things that could be happening. Mm-hmm. So how do you find yourself in that mindset of, okay, I was this person, this hat I wore maybe, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm becoming this. And so that releasing and receiving, and that's something that's just very interesting to me because it doesn't have to be either or.
Right.
Like you don't have to be a like mom of a high schooler and now you're not a mom anymore because you don't have a high schooler.
Right.
You can now be also an empty nester that's the mom of a college age child.
Right.
You know, or you could be a boss who's now becoming like a supporting manager at another company, you know, and that doesn't change who you are, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah. Well, I think I see multiple layers to that.
So
I
many.
see identity, right?
Oh yeah, that's good.
And then I see role and assignment, like motherhood was one of the things that you mentioned, or if it's a role of a career. But then I also see in that, I see categories, right? So if like a mom, and if there's a person whose child's going off to college, they were a mom of a high schooler, but now they're not, they might think, well, I'm not a mom anymore because my kid doesn't need me as much. No, you're forever a mom because mom is a role or an assignment. High school is a category.
Well, so
College is a category, right? Mom to a newborn is a category. But beyond that, we have identity. And so when our identity is founded in our roles and assignments, we can lose sight of who we are when those roles and assignments change.
Oh, that's good. That's really good. Because like when I was a middle school teacher, you know, for 7 years, middle school and junior high. And so what I really saw parents, people think there's a struggle when kids go off to college. Let me tell you when there really is a struggle. When a kid goes from elementary to middle school. Because you were the room mom, you were at the Christmas party, you were at everything. And now all of a sudden they've got 7 teachers. They're changing classes. You're no longer emailing or texting the same person. You have no idea what they're doing in the day. And all of a sudden they have all these friends and they have a phone. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so that transition, this identity crisis I saw with parents was very difficult. It was a very difficult transition for them because who you are to the parent of a young elementary child is very different when they move into this social realm of like middle school and junior high and this whole different world, you know? And so it's very similar to the college transition. But I like what you said though, because if who you are is founded by your role or your assignment, when that changes, then we don't know who we are.
Right.
So how do you figure, if you find yourself in that spot, which I feel like people do.
Yeah.
You know, that's how you have, what do they call it, midlife crises, and so you get a red Corvette and all this, I don't know, like people would talk about growing up, but hopefully I'm not in one and I just don't know it, so I say that offhandedly. But what do you do if you find yourself identifying by your role instead of who you are?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know that I have a profound answer. I have a curiosity about it. And one thing I would say curiously is that when we believe that our roles ever exist mutually exclusive of one another, we have boxed ourselves into a compartment that we never belonged to be in.
Do you mean like I am a business owner
at work
and a mom
at home?
Yeah. And
mutually exclusive. And it's just not the case that we attempt to compartmentalize in order to cope with our life and its many circumstances.
That's it. That's why we do it, huh? Yeah.
And so because the gray area doesn't feel comfortable. I don't know how to be a mom while I'm at work.
Like be a working mom.
Right. Or I don't know how to still know that I am the leader of a Fortune 500 company and a mom on the floor playing with a toddler.
Or a caregiver to my aging parent.
So we choose to be eithers because it's hard to be boths. And so because we don't want to accept the fact that we're not simple people, that we are these really multifaceted creatures. And so to a person who finds themselves so attached to the roles that they fulfill, I would say that you're going to have to get comfortable in the messy middle before you find your way through to the other side. That you're going to have to get comfortable being curious, to ask yourself, who am I? Before I had a role assigned to my life, who was I? What did I enjoy doing? Like you were talking about early on in the podcast series of having hobbies, like not knowing what your hobbies were and being able to attune to yourself and what you liked and who you are at the core of yourself. And so it is a level of self-awareness, and it can be so easy to get distracted with all of the roles that we fulfill every single day, especially as women, because we wear so many hats. And I mean, men too, like men are diverse and multifaceted creatures. I'm not trying to elevate one over another, but I only have experience as a woman. So that's all I can speak from. But that we find ourselves inside of so many different assignments. But sometimes we just have to get back to the basics of who are we at the core of our being, and asking ourselves those bigger questions and being willing to grapple with it and being willing for it to get really ugly before it gets better.
Well, I think too, you have that moment of, oh my gosh, I don't know who I am.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how did I let myself get to a place that I didn't know who I am? And then you become judgmental of yourself.
So we have curiosity.
Yes.
And then we condemn the curiosity
because
it shouldn't exist, because we should be further along. And that's how we should just drop the word should.
That's why we just should drop.
Right?
Just should. Yes, those two words. Yes.
There's so much shame
and
inside
all
of those two
that
words.
Came up in our own brains, and none of it was real.
Right. And we have unspoken expectation. And so when we don't have an awareness of who we are, we don't know our true identity, then we don't know what we're moving from in the world, right? For me, I'm always moving from my identity as a child of God inside of each of my assignments. And so as I'm moving through motherhood, I'm doing so as a child of God. When I'm moving through marriage, I'm doing so as a child of God. When I'm moving through my pastoring roles, I'm doing so as a child of God. When I'm moving through my relationships and my ever-changing femininity, my body, my maturity, I'm always moving through it as a core component of my identity, for which me as a child of God, that's my core identity. That's how I see myself. And so if we don't know who we are at our core, if we don't know our personality, if we don't know our strengths, if we don't know our gifts, if we don't know how we perceive the world and how we interact with it and engage with it, we don't know our feelings, then we don't really know our identity, and then we can't really fulfill all of our roles and assignments. At best, we're being a manufactured copy of how we've seen someone else do it.
Yeah.
But when we know our true identity and we're moving through that into all of the spaces and places we've been called, then we're doing it in the unique way that God's called us to, and the unique way we've been designed to, and then everyone around us, including ourselves, are better off for it.
I love it. I love it. It makes me think of so in James Clear's book, Atomic Habits.
Yes.
He talks about, like, when you're wanting to change something about yourself or develop a new habit, like let's say you want to become somebody that is physically active.
Yep.
Right? He says you have to look at it through the lens of, what would a physically active person do? Just like you say, what would a child of God do?
Yeah.
Who am I? How is this through that lens? And so wherever you find yourself in this journey, I think it's important to know that you can shift your perspective.
Yes.
To I am a person who, what does a person do who does that? Like when I wake up in the morning and I don't want to go run, well, what does a runner do? They get up and go run.
Yeah.
Yeah, today it's 30 degrees, didn't go run. Didn't care. Just said no. You know, and sometimes you do. You don't ever get it all right.
Yeah.
But it's that constant pursuit of becoming who it is that you want to be.
Right.
You know?
And I think sometimes we grapple with, because it isn't easy, it isn't for me. And it can be both hard and right. It can be hard and right, and those could feel like if it's hard, then it must be wrong, and if it's right, then it's going to be easy.
Yes.
No, it can be both,
Hard
and that
and
creates
right.
tension that we have to figure out how to navigate from the truth of who we are as a human, our true identity. But it can be both hard and right. It can be hard to become an active person, and right to have to figure out how to get there by thinking what an active person would do. It can be both hard and right. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Or it doesn't have to align with this former preconception of what we thought it would look like, that it can be both hard and right.
Yes, I love that.
Or any other juxtaposition that creates tension for us to navigate.
Yes. I mean, I think that before we started recording today, you said, we got to narrow this down because we could talk about this for hours and hours. And so I think the takeaway, like from this episode, as I would say, is to know that all the emotions, all the things can be both and. They don't have to be mutually exclusive of each other,
right?
And to stop trying to put ourselves in the box of either or, this or that, him or me, that it can be all at the same time. And I like the verbiage that you use about us being complex beings, because it really isn't that simple. And so we don't have to feel that simply.
Yeah. And I would say that if there's a person listening who has been told, it just isn't that hard. Life just isn't that hard. You're just too complex, that you're listening to the wrong voices.
Yeah, get in a different room.
Yeah, because we are complex people. And when we attempt to simplify ourselves, then we lead ourselves to a scarcity mentality. We compare ourselves too often, and we find ourselves backed into a corner where we're not being the people that we're meant to be, built to be, and called to be.
That's right. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah. We wrap up on that note.
That's good.
Man, that's been a good series.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so fun.
Navigating's been awesome. It's been great. We'll have to resurrect this again.
Yeah, navigating's been good. And I think for navigation, a lot of times, like if you get in your car and you're going on a vacation and you're taking a road trip and you put your final destination in, and your goal is to get from point A to point B. And my encouragement would be that as you're navigating, don't forget to look out the window and enjoy the journey.
Enjoy the journey. I love it. I love that. Until next time. Thanks for listening to The Grit Crusade. I'm Brooke Plack. Join me again next week on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. This podcast is produced by ClintonCreative.com.